Hi, my name is Monika Pate, and I would like to invite you to my watercolor exhibit titled Exploring Textures and Colors, which is displayed at the Arts Councils of Brazos Valley. I've been working in watercolor since 1994. My background is science, and I got my master's degree in animal physiology from University of Warsaw. I was born and raised in Warsaw, Poland. And I started painting in '94. It was sort of an accident or kind of a coincidence. I always liked drawing, but I didn't really paint. The painting came later, and it was something interesting to explore. I took some classes and some lessons in watercolor, and I decided that this was something I wanted to pursue a little bit further and learn more about it. And since I really started getting more into the watercolor, I realized that was a love at the first brushstroke, so to speak. My style of painting changed over the years. It's been almost 30 years, and it was a lot looser. It was a lot more spontaneous. When I started painting, I also explored other media like pastels, colored pencils, acrylics, a little bit of oils, and but watercolor was always my favorite medium. And specifically, details, and maybe that's the scientific background that I learned during my college years. But I always like to explore the details. I always explored the techniques, and decided that my main interest is the realistic approach. The other common feature for all of my artwork is the influence of strong sunlight, because I feel like objects look more three-dimensional when they're exposed to sunlight. I always take my photos that I use as a reference in the sunlight when the sky is perfectly blue and the sun is really strong, so I can see the cast shadows, I can see the reflected light, I can see reflections from other objects. I like a lot of different subjects, so the common theme is definitely the influence of the light. However, I do like to explore the textures and the colors. Therefore, if you look at my paintings, you'll see that the colors are very intense, very vivid. There's a lot of contrast, the light and dark. I really like the contrast. I feel, again, like I can emphasize certain details, certain objects, and then tone down some other ones that I feel like maybe are not very important for my subject, for my painting. So, if you look at the exhibit or my body of work, there are so many different subjects, starting with florals, and that's growing up in Poland. We had a garden. I grew up surrounded by flowers, and we grew a lot of various flowers, roses and magnolias and tulips and daffodils. So I was always surrounded by lots of flowers. So that's, I guess, is a very important part of my life. I love gardening. I love nature. Other things that I really like to explore is still life. Still life gives me opportunity to also explore lots of different textures, starting with glass, crystal, or some objects that are more like metal, reflective surfaces. I also have been experimenting with various objects that have rusty textures, cars, mechanical objects. Just really, it's a very interesting technique I apply a lot of different techniques, so it's very interesting for me to work on these variety of objects. I like to change things. I like to explore different things. I like to, I don't like to work on the same subject too long because I feel like I'm not learning. And every painting I do is a challenge. Every new piece of artwork is something to learn. And therefore, I like to explore different subjects and different techniques, and just apply them to my work. Some of the paintings that I feel I like close-ups of nature a lot. So like there's a water lily or fuchsias. The water lily is a very close view of a flower. It's for the composition sake, I cropped it because I felt like the focal area is the yellow center, but then the warm colors of the center really contrast with the cooler bluish gray shadows of the petals. And I think that the beauty of a lot of the objects is when you look really close and explore them. We often pass objects that we ignore them, but there is so much beauty if you look a lot closer. The same is with the rocks. Like there is a landscape. I've been really experimenting with landscapes and rocks and textures. Speaking of textures, so that was a little bit different for me, because I don't really paint landscapes. I haven't done very many over the past 30 years. But this one was, it was a challenge, and I really wanted the challenge. I really wanted to see how I can depict the realistic look of the rocks with watercolor. And one thing I wanted to point out is that I work in transparent watercolor most of the time, which means I don't use white paint. All I use is I save the white of the paper, and the dark colors that are often visible in my art, it's layers of paint. I don't use black either. So these are layers of various pigments that I add on top of each other, and the combination of them gives me the really deep darks. So the contrast that I create is really without the white and the black paint. It's just a contrast I create using the pigments or saving the whites of the paper. So the other group of paintings that I really would like to talk about is the group that has a lot of glass and crystal. And often I get asked, how do you make it look so three-dimensional, and how do you paint glass? And it really is a pattern. It's looking at patterns. It's looking at the relation between the colors, the values, the contrasts, and just basically putting it on the paper. Because creating three-dimensional object on two-dimensional paper could be quite challenging. So I always make sure that I emphasize that contrast enough to create this realistic glass and crystal texture. And there is clear glass. Obviously, there could be colored glass, and I did paintings that had colored glass in them as well. And so the techniques are similar, because we always look at the patterns. But basically, painting glass is painting a lot of shapes and observing really the relation between the colors and the values and the shapes. And in these two rose paintings, I use the same crystal vase that actually came from my native Poland. Poland is well known for its crystal. And that vase looks completely different depending on the light, the background, what's reflected in it, the color of the flowers that are in the vase. So it's a completely different look, and I painted this vase many times. It's one of my favorites. It has a very clean geometric pattern. But the way it's made, it has so many very, very it looks so different every time I look at it, and you can move it literally half an inch and have completely different looking face. So this is definitely one of my favorites for when I work on still lifes. There are some other glass and crystal, example bowls, and there was a time that I did a lot of cherries for some reason and grapes. One of these paintings, like this one, was published in one of the books. Was published by Northlight Books. It was called Splash 19, The Best of Watercolor. And this was a kind of interesting impromptu arrangement. I wasn't planning on painting this arrangement. It was just sitting on the side, and I was working on a still life for a workshop that I was going to teach on glass, but I was using different objects. And these grapes were sitting in a bowl and next to my arrangement. And then all of a sudden I looked at it and I saw the light coming through, and I thought, well, this is perfect. So I started taking photos of that arrangement, and it ended up being published in the book. So it's just one of those situations that sometimes things happen when you don't expect it. But most of my work, I make the arrangements and the still lifes myself, and I take the photos outside. As I mentioned at the beginning, I like the sunlight, so there is no substitute for sunlight, so I always take them outside, because I think when the light comes through objects, everything looks really beautiful. And especially glass and crystal, like these two bowls on the sides, they also create really pretty reflections and patterns, especially when the glass has a pattern on it that creates very interesting reflections. And then another group of paintings that has some metal, shiny metal or rusty textures. These also, I often see things when I'm driving somewhere, or like in this case of that pump jack that was, I took an image, took a photo at the place in Bryan. There's a gentleman who repairs these pump jacks, and I was just driving by his place, and I saw, oh my goodness, this is a perfect subject for painting, and I asked him for permission if I can just walk around and take photos, and after a long conversation, he allowed me to go there and take the pictures. And so I ended up painting. Actually, I think I did 3 paintings from that area. But I really loved the blue against the orange. The contrast between the colors, the complementary colors, and the values, and it was really fun to play with the rusty texture. I really like that here in this case, and also in the case of those rusty doorknobs that actually came from an antique place in Fredericksburg. I used water-soluble pencils, which is a little bit, so this is not quite a transparent watercolor, but still I didn't use any white paint or black, just the watercolor pencils to help me enhance the texture of the rust and make it look more realistic. In terms of shiny metal, I always get asked, like, how do you paint silver or metal? It's kind of like with glass. You just paint the shapes, the values, the relation between the shape and the values. So it's a long process, and all my paintings take quite a long time to complete, because they start with an idea. Then once I know what I want to paint, I have to do the pencil sketch. I want to put the amount of detail that I need. And then I start painting. So before I even start painting, the process takes some time to think about the art piece, and before I even complete it, it's a pretty long process. But it's a journey. It's a very rewarding process. I feel like I will never. The longer I paint, the less I know. It's definitely a journey. I love to learn. I love to explore new techniques and more techniques. I like definitely watercolor the most. I tried a little bit of oil painting, and I like that too, but watercolor will always be my favorite. Well, thank you so much for joining me, and this concludes the description of my exhibit. You can find more information about me below.